Unless you've been living under a rock, shaped like the Paris Olympics for the last week, you'll be aware that the presidential elections have taken place in Venezuela, one of Brazil's neighbours to the north. Nicolás Maduro, whose government in Venezuela has become increasingly militaristic, authoritarian, and anti-democratic over its 11-year lifespan, they went into this week's vote with, for the first time ever, what looked like a real chance of defeat. But to the surprise of the opposition, results announced by the National Electoral Council had Maduro winning 51.2% of the vote, results which have been heavily contested since, and the outcome of the election is anything but clear even today, a few days on from the vote. Venezuela is important to Brazil for many reasons. It's not a big trading partner, far from it actually, but it holds pragmatic and ideological significance to the country, and Brazil's response, or lack thereof, to the election results has become an important factor in the post-vote scenario in Caracas. My name's Ewan Marshall, editor of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil. If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Andrei Novoseltsev, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renacido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozzy Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. Now, before we go back to today's episode, we'd like to show you a little bit of our new series. Today's episode will be split into two parts. First, I'll speak to our Latin America editor, Ignacio Portes, to bring you up to speed on the post-election period, and then I'll speak to Brasilia correspondent Cede Silva to examine Brazil's role in the situation and why this is such an important role for the Brazilian government. But first, Ignacio, thanks for joining us. So, ahead of this election, this looked like the closest Maduro would ever come to defeat. Polls had this down as a clear win for the opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, but the results that were announced by the National Electoral Council, they showed a pretty sizable win for Maduro. I know that a lot of foreign nations weren't exactly taking these polls as gospel, but is such a change like that even statistically possible? Like, fill us in on what's going on in Venezuela at the moment.
Well, what we saw on Sunday night was initially the generalist feeling that Edmundo Gonzalez had won the election before the authorities announced the results. We saw that on the individual precincts and ballot boxes that were where the votes were counted, and that Gonzalez had a significant advantage over Maduro in every area, even in poor neighborhoods. You started seeing, this usually happens in elections across Latin America, that you start, before the official numbers are put up in a website, like consolidated, you start seeing that each area, each school closes its partial account, and the results start leaking through Twitter, through Facebook, through Instagram, through WhatsApp, and you kind of start seeing who's going to win, or if there's a surprise, if it's closer than it looked, and so on. And it was actually the distance was broader than it had looked in previous days in polls. In the polls of the last couple of weeks, Edmundo Gonzalez was winning by a 2-1 margin, really. But when the big question had been in the run-up to Sunday had been whether Maduro would accept defeat, because we had seen already over the past decade that the Chavista government had become increasingly unwilling to accept defeats. It lost an important midterm election in 2015, in which the opposition secured 2/3 of parliament, which allowed them to do every kind of even constitutional change and so on. And then they de facto canceled that election and replaced parliament with a new pro-Maduro parliament. Then there was another presidential election in 2018 in which they banned most of the opposition, and Maduro won comfortably, despite the fact that Venezuela was in the worst economic crisis in its history. having seen its GDP drop by three quarters and dramatic figures that are only comparable to countries in civil wars or dramas of that kind. And Maduro still took 65% of the vote versus candidates that were just a minor evangelical pastor and a guy who was really also on Maduro's side, but now pretending to criticize him a little bit. So, but in 2024, the big difference was that despite the fact that they still banned a couple of candidates, including opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, they had allowed Edmundo González to run. Edmundo González is more of a centrist and maybe a little bit more palatable to the regime, much less charismatic than Machado. But there was the question of, okay, maybe they tolerate this guy. This guy might not persecute them or send them to jail if they go to the opposition. So maybe they'll accept defeat. But we have to see. But what we saw by 1 a.m. Venezuelan time on Sunday was that the official electoral authorities that are controlled by the government read from a paper that Maduro got 51%, Edmundo González got 44%, and half an hour later, there was a press conference organized by the opposition saying that the results were invented, outright invented, just fraud, that they had the acts that showed that they actually got 2/3 of the vote. And now we're seeing a potentially chaotic situation with street protests and so on, and increasing signs that the opposition is probably right and that the election was stolen by authorities because they have not released even a single data point other than that Maduro came first with that number of votes and the other guy came second with the other number of votes, but no details on individual precincts, on state data, nothing else, which looks tremendously suspicious.
And I think the main question that I've got here is about, what is the Maduro government's arguments at the moment? Like, what are they saying? Are they just saying that these results are gospel? You have to pay attention to these results. Like, how can they explain the disparity between the polls with what the opposition's saying? What's the explanation coming from the government at the moment?
Yes, they have their own line of arguments. They have a huge propaganda structure that always toes a different line and has alternative explanations for what's going on. They had their own polls in the build-up to the election from companies that are very close to the government that said that Maduro was above, in some cases comfortably above. But these are firms that are known to be close to the government. And generally, the consensus was that González was ahead by at least 5 to 10 points, and in some cases by 30 to 40 points. And it seems like he was ahead by quite a big margin. And this is so there was a narrative by the government that he was going to win and that this is not a surprise. But what we're also seeing, what in the very brief press conference that the electoral authorities organized on Sunday, they said there was a terrorist attack against the election system, that is the reason why the website that is supposed to count the results has been impossible to use from Sunday. If you go to right now to cne.com.ve, I think it is, you can, which is the site of the electoral authority, you get a 404 error, impossible to communicate with the website, and so on. And this has been the case since Sunday. There has been no data released through any other means, not even on paper, not even on their media. They just say the details are still not available due to this mysterious terrorist attacks, which the prosecutor general on Monday said that were a conspiracy led by Maria Corina Machado, which is the opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez, which is a former opposition leader, also pretty right-wing guy, who has also been banned by the government, and a couple of other opposition figures, that they created a troll attack from North Macedonia, I'm not making this up, to bring down the electoral system and cause chaos and give these alternative figures that they are giving. But this narrative seems to be not have a lot of credibility, even inside Venezuela. And Machado is making tremendous efforts to to offer a counter narrative with these individual acts that they rescued from the voting centers, which they don't. When the school closes, you get a little piece of paper that says, okay, in this school, Maduro got 200 votes and Edmundo Gonzalez got 400 votes, and you take it, and the representative of the party of each party takes it home, and you have that as a safety mechanism to prove that the process was clean, and then you can contrast that with the official results that are uploaded to the website. This is the Venezuelan electoral system, and it's a pretty solid system. It's an electronic system with physical backing. It's pretty, it makes everyone happy. Every kind of supporter of different voting systems happy because it has both at the same time. But if you just use your military to say, give a press release and say that the numbers were different, well, there's very little you can do other than contest that narrative, right?
And it's interesting, Ignacio, because in a lot of the campaign, a lot of the time leading up to this, we had all of these opposition candidates being barred, but then eventually, as you mentioned, that Edmundo Gonzalez was allowed to run. And there seemed to be these kind of discussions that, okay, it looks like the Maduro government might lose this election, but there's also talks of, a kind of post-election amnesty sort of thing. Like maybe Gonzalez would be the only candidate that the government would allow to stand against them because, there wasn't going to be any sort of, major pushback or major, criminal implications for members of the Maduro government if they were to lose the election. But that seems to have kind of gone out the window now. If Maduro, the government, is claiming that they've won this election after all, despite a lot of the evidence suggesting otherwise, what can we expect? Because I know we've got the new government, whoever it does end up being, is only going to come into office at the end of this year. So we've got this really long, confusing period happening in Venezuela. What can we expect from the next coming months?
Well, everyone knew that the transition was going to be extremely complicated. It's a 6-month transition between the election and the swearing-in ceremony, and you always knew that in those 6 months there would be complicated negotiations. That the Venezuelan army would hold massive power. That the U.S. that has been negotiating with the Maduro government for a few years now, behind closed doors mostly, but also they've been, we don't know all the details, but we know quite a bit of what they discussed. The U.S. has said, U.S. media says actually that the government is willing to abandon some of the investigative cases against Maduro and the Maduro circle in the U.S. They are accused of all kinds of crimes, including drug trafficking and some other severe crimes that could lead to extraditions and jail and all kinds of problems for the leadership of the Venezuelan government. The New York Times has said that there is serious consideration being given in government circles to abandon these investigations in exchange for a peaceful transition in Venezuela. And Edmundo Gonzalez himself, the opposition is obviously in even much closer contact with the U.S. than Maduro, obviously, because Maduro is geopolitically closer to Russia and China. But and so Edmundo Gonzalez has also said stuff of this kind about, we're willing to discuss an amnesty, even if it sounds bad. This is how transitions to democracy are often done. We've seen this in countries like Chile, in South Africa, in the Soviet Union, and so on. There's always some kind of power share agreement to ensure that you don't go to a civil war and that one side isn't destroyed and so on. This has been the discussion before the election, but probably for the optimistic, I guess, the surprise was that Maduro simply lied about results. But this could still be in play potentially in the 6 months to come. To keep having these discussions, if Maduro is very cornered and it's very obvious that the results are fake, and he starts losing support even among his core base in Venezuela or among his neighbors in the region, maybe there is room for this discussion about a transition. Or there's also the pessimistic outlook, which is that the protests in the streets that we're not starting to see are repressed by the government, just like we saw in Nicaragua when something similar happened and the government banned all opposition candidates and so on. The Nicaraguan regime said, we don't care about your protests. We're going to kill hundreds of protesters if we need. and we're going to stay in power. They might do that, but their internal support is lower. It remains to be seen whether they will have the decision to do something like that in the open and just like become an obvious and kind of caricature of a dictatorship, or if they will be looking for some kind of way out. It's an open scenario, but there are some pessimistic ones and some more optimistic ones, but a lot could go wrong still, certainly.
Yeah, understood. Okay, just to finish off then, I mean, you mentioned about, you actually mentioned China and Russia there, and you mentioned some of Venezuela's neighbours. How has this result gone down around the world then? What's the situation?
Well, I think Sede can talk more about Brazil later, but certainly in the big geopolitical sphere of Russia, China, the US, the obvious alliances were clearly in display. Russia and China immediately said, these elections are perfect, we don't see any problem. And the US issued actually, they spoke to the press saying that they didn't say outright fraud. They said, we would need to see proof of that these results are real. We would need to see the detailed tabulated results of each precinct and so on to believe these numbers that were given, and there's understandable suspicion and so on. So we are seeing the classic geopolitical alliances, but we're also seeing that, for example, typical allies or people that are in relatively good terms with Maduro in the region, in Latin America, have been very critical of them now. Particularly the case of President Boric in Chile has been very poignant. He has said, we will not recognize a government that cannot verify the results of the election. And this was taken extremely badly by Maduro, who kicked out the Chilean ambassador from Venezuela in the same breath as he kicked out the ambassador from Argentina, which obviously has a much more right-wing government than Javier Milei, who called him outright a communist dictator. But that was more predictable, right? He also kicked the ambassador for Uruguay, who has a center-right president, but and 7 or 8 countries, Paraguay, Costa Rica, and so on. But what's interesting is you could maybe predict the right-wing governments, but he's also in a clear open fight with center-left governments. So the isolation is growing, the walls are closing in a bit, and when the walls are closing in, you can make rash decisions. You can try to escape. You can respond with violence. We'll see what ways out the opposition offers to him, and what they see as credible as an alternative, and how this all continues. But this is going to be an intense few weeks coming up in Venezuela for sure.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ignacio. Fascinating stuff. Looking forward to read more about this on the website, Brazilian.report. And obviously, if we get any further developments, might get you back on the podcast as well. Thanks a lot, Ignacio.
Not a problem. My pleasure.
And as promised, for the second part of this episode, we're going to focus on Brazil's reaction to the election results and why exactly Venezuela is such an important issue in the country. And to do that, I've got our Brasilia correspondent, Sede Silva, on the line. Sede, great to speak to you.
Thank you for having me, Ewan.
And so, as I alluded to in the introduction of the podcast, Venezuela is not a particularly important trade partner to Brazil. Culturally, they're quite different. But Venezuela holds huge symbolic importance for Brazilian politics. Could you explain to us why?
Well, first, Venezuela is a key neighbor of Brazil, which is always important. Venezuela is an Amazonian country, just like Brazil. And Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, which has gained even more importance as Brazil has also increased its oil production in the last few years. And the Brazilian government is currently considering an invitation to join OPEC Plus, which is a loose association associated to the OPEC oil cartel, which of course has Saudi Arabia, other oil-producing countries, and of which Venezuela is a very important member. Venezuela's importance also grew in Brazil recently because of the failed government in Venezuela and because of the increasing poverty in Venezuela. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, and over 600,000 of them have come to Brazil over the last few years. So the issue of migration in Brazil, which is not at all an issue of domestic political importance as it is in the United States, has grew in Brazil, especially in the northern state of Roraima, which borders Venezuela, because of Venezuelan migration. Also, politically and culturally, Venezuela over the last few years, even already during the late Hugo Chavez regime, became a sort of boogeyman of the political right, in that Brazilian politicians and Brazilian right-wing pundits will look to Venezuela as a bad example and say that if you vote for the left, or if you vote for Lula, or if you support the Workers' Party, Brazil will end up just like Venezuela, which means with a lot of poverty, unemployment, and violence.
Yeah, that's, as you say, exactly. It's every single moment in Brazil where you have some sort of, potential left-wing victory. That means for a lot of people on the right that, the Brazil is automatically going to turn into Venezuela overnight. I'm not exactly sure how that would work, but it's one of these tropes that consistently gets repeated in Brazilian political discourse, right? Not necessarily, really well thought out and justified Brazilian political discourse, but it's certainly really prevalent, isn't it?
Yeah, it has become increasingly reasonable for people to say so, even though Brazil is still, of course, a long way from becoming similar to Venezuela, also because of local history. We could go on decades about that, but it has become increasingly easy for the right to do so, precisely because there are indeed very close relationships between Lula's Workers' Party and the Nicolás Maduro regime. Nicolás Maduro visited Brasilia last year, which was the first year of the current Lula administration. And during that meeting, Lula openly defended Venezuela. He openly defended Maduro, and he spoke against sanctions against Venezuela, which is a key talking point for Brazilian foreign policy, for the US and other countries not to sanction Venezuela. And he defended that Venezuela actually has a democracy, and Venezuela should create its own narrative about a democracy. So you had Lula openly supporting the regime in Venezuela and openly stating that, in his view, Venezuela is unjustly treated by the international community, when in fact, according to Lula, it would be a functional democracy. Of course, over the last few weeks, with Maduro's rhetoric becoming increasingly openly violent, and with the elections approaching, Brazil decided to take a more cautious approach publicly, but which, in my understanding, is also misleading, just as is Brazilian foreign policy in Russia. So you have a policy that is theoretically neutral, that is theoretically balanced, but in fact favors Russia, or in this case, favors Venezuela. So, for instance, Celso Amorim, Lula's top advisor for international affairs, Lula's former foreign minister, he was in Venezuela this weekend for the election. He was Brazil's sole official observer in the executive branch to observe Venezuelan elections. And Amorim's policy, and later Itamaraty's, the foreign affairs ministry policy, is of theoretically being cautious. So Brazil has not congratulated Maduro on the win, and has not congratulated opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez either. So Brazil is taking a cautious approach. But in my understanding, this cautious approach actually favors Venezuela, because Brazil is asking for the individual results of the ballot boxes to be published, so Brazil can know how Maduro or Gonzalez won. But Nicolás Maduro has declared himself as the winner without this publication. So in my understanding, this is just like Three-Card Monte. Three-Card Monte is that street scam game. There are 3 cards. You're supposed to find the red card to get the prize. But in fact, the game is rigged. You can never find the red card because the guy is manipulating the cards on his hand. So Amorim, in my understanding, he's asking Maduro to show the red card. But there is no red card. Just, it's a scam. He has already declared himself the winner. So in my understanding, this cautious approach by Brazil actually masks a pro-Maduro approach, a pro-Maduro policy, just like Brazil is supposedly neutral in the Russia-Ukraine war. But in this case, if you are in favor of negotiations while the Russians are still inside Ukraine, you are not neutral. You are pro-Russia because the Russians are still in. It's the same logic.
And I mean, interesting that you're mentioning there about the kind of the ties between the Lula's Workers' Party and, of course, the Maduro government in Venezuela. I mean, we've seen some in the lead up to the elections. We certainly saw that kind of relationship being tested a little bit, didn't we? I mean, there was some mentions, some declarations on one side, on the Venezuelan side, and some also quite, as you mentioned, the watchword seems to be quite cautious in Brazil's replies to these declarations. I mean, if you could just take us through that kind of back and forth a little bit, I think that may be quite interesting for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So the political cost for Brazil to have normal relations with Venezuela increased. Maduro said in a statement about 11 days before the election that there would be a bloodshed if he lost. And Lula then replied saying, well, elections shouldn't lead to a bloodshed. In Portuguese, in Brazil, bloodshed, we use the word bath, so bloodbath. And so Lula said that actually in elections, you should take a shower of votes, not a shower of blood. And then Maduro replied back without mentioning Lula that people that are frightened by his remarks should take chamomile tea, with this tea that is supposedly serves to calm you down. Also, Maduro falsely claimed that Brazil's voting system and other voting systems in the Americas are not auditable. And this remark proved very serious because after Maduro said that Brazil's voting system is not auditable, Brazil's Superior Electoral Court, which is Brazil's top electoral agency, and in Brazil, the electoral agency is ran by the judicial branch, they withdrew their observer mission. So they would send observers to the election in Venezuela, but at the last minute, they canceled that because of Maduro's remark. So that was a political price that Maduro had to pay because of his aggressive rhetoric against Brazil and Brazilian elections. And the thing now with Maduro is he already declared himself the winner. Brazil is taking theoretically a cautious approach, but Maduro really doesn't care about publishing the results of the ballot boxes. He's already declared himself the winner. And now Brazil is in a difficult situation where it might be awkward to recognize a Maduro victory after they ask something that Maduro is not willing to give. And so Brazil is now negotiating that situation. As for the connections between Lula and Maduro, they go way back. There is an organization called the São Paulo Forum. I have written about this organization in the Brazilian Report last year. The São Paulo Forum is a loose coalition of left-wing Latin American parties, which was founded in 1990, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this coalition of Latin American left-wing parties has a meeting every year. They had a meeting this year, a few weeks ago, and they have a strong solidarity amongst themselves. So on Monday night, the Brazilian Workers' Party, which is Lula's party, published a statement congratulating Nicolás Maduro for his win. And other left-wing Brazilian organizations, key organizations, such as the MST, the Landless Workers Movement, which is very closely associated with the Workers' Party, also congratulated Maduro for his win. So it is very unlikely that the left wing and the Workers' Party would do this if they understood that Lula was about to break with Maduro or something like that. Lula is very invested in the Maduro regime, and it is very unlikely that that will change anytime soon.
Okay, interesting stuff there, Sede. Thanks a lot for joining us, and we'll be on the lookout for more updates from you in the coming days and weeks. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ian. See you next time.
If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Or better yet, subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. And our work has been recognised for its quality. We've won several international awards. In April 2024, the Brazilian Report was named the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom by the World Association of News Publishers, WANIFRA, and more recently, the Brazilian report won the best story at the 2024 Digiday Media Awards for our story on the hacking attempt of one of Brazil's Supreme Court justices. And to continue doing this work, we need your support, so go to Brazilian.report. I'm Ewan Marshall, thanks for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.